So update 5.5 came out, finally bringing the much needed night vision mechanic into Evrima, and unsurprisingly everyone disliked it. However, credit where credit is due, the update came out a mere month after nesting was implemented, which is pretty fast even for the industry standards, so good job on that. But even though we didn't have to wait much, people don't seem too happy about it. Night vision in the Isle is a mechanic that exists for quite some time. Since its first implementation back in September 2016, this particular feature of the Isle has received several iterations throughout the years, but for the most part, it seems that night vision, and night in general, was always heavily criticized in both Legacy and Evrima alike. And that begs the question, does this mechanic have a genuine problem, or is it just unjustified popular distaste for it? But before we find the answer, let's analyze the current iteration and see what's good and what's not so good. For a start, the area affected by the night vision is significantly larger compared to Legacy's. Most of the criticism towards this mechanic in the past was how small the visible area was, being so small that if a dinosaur was charging the player, most people wouldn't be fast enough to react accordingly due to how close the aggressor was before being visible, making Legacy night vision almost useless when it comes to PvP, an aspect that was fortunately fixed. The increased diameter gives a respectful area where people are able to detect other players and have a decent time window to respond to incoming threats. Regarding the vision itself, instead of simulating military vision goggles like in the past, this time it has been replaced by white outlines that cover the environment and the players. An interesting note is that once the sun rises and the luminosity levels increase, the player's night vision slowly fades away until it practically has no effect. A much welcome change in comparison to the accidental flashbangs in Legacy.
Hey, you. Finally awake.
Another great aspect are the blood trails presented in vivid red smoke, a massive contrast to the surrounding environment, making it very easy to read even in highly dense forests. That's some great UX right there. However, the system has some big issues. Despite the improvements they made while it was still in QA, water and rock formations are still very difficult to see, including ledges and cliffs. The outlines are also very unnoticeable on other players, especially while moving, which is problematic since being able to see people at night is what players want the most out of night vision. A much more serious complaint, however, are the numerous reports of people suffering from headaches after exposed to the bright outlines after certain periods of time, as well as people with epilepsy being completely unable to use night vision as it is currently, which sadly seems to not be a priority for the developers, but oh well. But this is just how the mechanic is right now. There are multiple additions developers intend to implement and that were already hinted at, such as diets being able to affect night vision in some capacity or that it will differ between species. Having different levels of night vision between the dinosaurs is good. It adds an extra component to the playable's kit that sharpens the niche that they are made for, or simply guides the player to adapt to a specific playstyle that wasn't being adopted to a specific dinosaur. A good example of this is Suchomimus in Legacy. After its remodel, it also received a nerf in walking speed but a small boost in swimming speed, as well as specific animation that tells the player that this dinosaur is used to be on water. In addition, Suchomimus is well known by the paleo community as a semi-aquatic. The end result was Sucho players 9 times out of 10 opting for being near water sources, a specific playstyle influenced by these small changes. Also, we don't need to go that far. Dilo's vision radius during nighttime was enough influence to make them almost purely nocturnal. You only see Dilos during nighttime for a reason. The same can happen in Evrima, and this time the developers are not as restricted as before. They can increase the radius, dino players being highlighted while tracking, or not needing to track them at all. With the huge roster they are planning to implement, several of those species will be nocturnal, and having each one's night vision having an exclusive extra mechanic or just a unique flavor to it would make each dino more unique and have higher chances of being viable despite the intense competition. The diet part is not so great, however. The problem is not so much night vision, but rather the diet system itself. Having it influence this new mechanic is more of a punishment that you are forced to remove than anything else. In fact, diet as a mechanic is a problem on its own, but I will address that in another video. Mechanics affecting aspects of the player experience is very common. Fog to temporarily limit player's vision, weight to limit the player's movement speed, flashes for momentary blindness, explosions for momentary deafness, etc. But even though these features are commonly used in many genres, using them too often or too intensely can easily cause frustration. Locomotion, audio, and vision are the major components that are affected in these conditions. However, while playing, they are not equally important. Audio is by far the lesser of the three. Some people even play games with no sound whatsoever. Although sound has a greater impact in survival games, it's still not important as movement. Games are an interactive media, and motion is the most direct way to interact with the game. Surprisingly though, players' movement can be impaired in a wider spectrum of forms and intensity before it becomes intrusive to the player's experience. For example, being slowed down by mud, water, or any other substance is not as intrusive as being completely locked in place for 10 seconds like in Ark with the Microraptor ability, or having our movement speed reduced by 19% for 5 or more minutes like in Legacy with Bone Break. That level of impairment is unbalanced and heavily intrusive to the player's experience. But by far the most important component is vision. Blindness is just, if not more, intrusive than movement reduction or movement lock. Developers very often use vision impairment in games, but they do it in very few circumstances and with very little intensity. Strong blindness effects usually take no more than 1 or 2 seconds like flashbangs in shooter games, while more prolonged forms of it don't give complete blindness like fog, smoke, or dark environments. Vision limitation is most commonly used in horror games to increase the power gap between the player and the dangers surrounding it. Not being able to see the majority of the environment easily inflicts a feeling of vulnerability on the player, making the fear factor of the game more efficient. More often than not, darkness and not knowing their surroundings scares people way more than scary figures or jump scares. Tension and suspense are slow burners but have a much greater effect in the long term. And that's exactly what the Isle wants to accomplish. Since the very beginning, that Afterthought's plan is to implement horror elements, adding that component on top of the survival aspect of the game. But in the end, that's the major problem with nighttime and consequently night vision in the Isle. It doesn't work. Before I explain the reason why, we need to understand the difference between horror and horror theme. Horror theme games have their narrative or aesthetic based in horror-based mythos or environments. The game's genre is not necessarily horror. Their intention is not to scare you. They use it merely as set dressing, to immerse you in the world they created. Left 4 Dead, Killing Floor, Carrion, and Doom are good examples of games that utilize stereotypical horror tropes and themes to build their lore, narrative, and aesthetic around. Horror games, however, have the fear aspect built inside its mechanics and features. The game's purpose is to terrorize you, to keep you on your toes, to deceive your senses and make you feel vulnerable, and they utilize many methods to achieve that. Silent Hill, FNAF, The Forest, and many others are some examples of titles that use terror as a core part of the player's experience. But why am I saying all of this, you might ask? The problem in the Isle is that they don't want to be a horror-themed game, but rather an actual horror game, and the way they want to do it just doesn't work. Horror, to be successful, requires the player to feel powerless and inferior to their environment. That's the main feeling devs want you to have. But while that is possible between humans without weapons and dinosaurs, between the dinos themselves, that just doesn't happen. Players won't be afraid of a ghost if they are just as vulnerable and weak as you are. Once you possess the tools and capabilities of dealing with your surrounding threats, the fear factor vanishes completely. Dinosaurs in the Isle, despite being mechanically different, their power gap is not overwhelming to a point that death is inevitable to them. Sure, weak dinosaurs like Dryo and Hypsy can't kill anything, but they have the tools like maneuverability and temporary vision impairment respectively to deal with danger even if those tools are non-lethal. Once you remove the fear factor, everything around it that would be used to increase its potency suddenly loses its effect and becomes detrimental to the experience. And that's why night vision itself doesn't work, because night vision isn't needed to begin with. Nights are extremely dark purposefully in order to enhance the fear factor that comes with nighttime. But that's the problem. There is no fear. At night, the overwhelming majority of players don't die in fear, they die in frustration because they can't see anything. Darkness with no fear is an annoyance. That's the reason why people always complain about night vision. The mechanic is deliberately made to give as little visual information as possible to keep the horror aspect of the game at its maximum. But once again, there's no fear in the Isle, hence why people will endlessly criticize night vision, because the feature is flawed on a fundamental level. No matter how well or how aesthetically pleasing they make it, it will never deliver what players want, being able to perfectly see at night. That's why Path of Titans and Beasts of Bermuda don't have this issue. Their nighttime is dark enough to give nocturnal animals the edge while still enabling everyone else to see 19% of its environment. The existence of day and night cycles in these games are for gameplay and immersion purposes only. So next time you play Evrima and you dislike the most recent iteration of the night vision, just keep in mind that despite you being right in criticizing it, the devs are simply trying to achieve a specific experience for all of us. Now, while this can work with humans as I mentioned previously, mercenaries in the Isle have massive problems on its own. If you want to know what those problems are specifically, make sure to check this video. A huge thank you to my Patreon supporters for supporting the channel and the content I create. If you wanna join the ranks, the link will be in the description. Don't forget to leave your thoughts and opinions down below, join our Discord server for memes and paleo nerd stuff, and I hope to see you next week.